Close your eyes and drift back to a time when the world was dimly lit by fire and fear. The air smells of damp straw and wood smoke. The bells of a distant church toll, slow, solemn, warning. A hooded figure walks the dirt road, his mask long and beaked, stuffed with herbs to ward off the stench of death. Behind him, a woman clutches her child, staring at fields that once fed her family, but now lie barren. This is not a fantasy. It is Europe in the Middle Ages, when the common people, the peasants, endured a world of famine, plague, and tyranny. And yet, they survived. They built, prayed, and sang. They buried their dead and went back to the fields. This is their story, not of kings and castles, but of the hands that sowed the wheat, baked the bread, and held the world together through centuries of darkness. Chapter 1. The World Before the Plague. Before death came riding on the wind, before the coughing and the fires and the blackened sores, Europe was already a hard place for the poor. The early 13th century, the decades before the Great Plague, was an age balanced on the edge of a knife. Fields stretched across the continent, divided into tiny strips, each one worked by peasants who owned nothing but their labor. Their days began before dawn and ended long after dusk, governed by the ringing of church bells and the demands of the Lord's bailiff. In England, in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, the rhythm of rural life had barely changed for centuries. A peasant's world was a small one, a cluster of thatched cottages surrounded by farmland, a church in the center, and beyond that, the manor, home of the Lord who ruled their lives. The villagers grew barley and rye, raised pigs and sheep, and prayed for rain, but not too much of it. Theirs was a life of constant calculation against nature. Yet there was order in that struggle. Everyone knew their place. The Lord provided protection, at least in theory, and the peasants paid in crops, labor, and loyalty. The church promised salvation, and in return demanded obedience and tithes. Even misery had meaning when the priest reminded them that earthly suffering was the path to heaven. The fragile balance. This balance was delicate, more fragile than anyone realized. A single bad harvest could bring hunger. 2 in a row could bring death. And in the early 1300s, the weather began to turn against them. Europe slipped quietly into what historians call the Little Ice Age. Summers grew colder and wetter, winters longer and crueler. Rains drowned the crops, and livestock diseases swept through the countryside. Between 1315 and 1317 came the Great Famine, when across much of northern Europe, entire villages starved. Peasants boiled bark for soup. They ate cats, dogs, and, if the whispers were true, sometimes worse. Mothers abandoned children they could no longer feed. Travelers wrote of corpses along the roads. In some towns, the price of bread rose tenfold. Famine did not kill with the speed of plague, but its shadow was longer. It lingered in weak bodies, in children stunted before they could grow, in the memory of hunger that never quite went away. And yet, they survived. They always did. Tools of survival. Survival meant knowing the land like an old friend. Peasants read the sky, the soil, and the seasons. They saved seeds from the best crops and shared them among neighbors. When the Lord's grain stores ran low, the women foraged. Nuts, berries, mushrooms, roots. When famine struck, they turned to barley gruel and peas porridge, to acorns ground into bitter bread. There were communal rules, too, unwritten but binding. No one starved alone. A family might take in a widow. A neighbor might lend a loaf for a day's work. The village was not just a place, it was a web of obligation, a living shield against despair. Their faith helped them endure. The church calendar was filled with holy days and feasts, small mercies that broke the monotony of toil. They believed sickness and famine were trials sent by God, and prayer could turn his wrath away. Pilgrims trudged to shrines seeking miracles, carrying wax images of diseased limbs. Monks copied psalms by candlelight, whispering for mercy upon the common folk outside their cloisters. Lords and laws. Above them all stood the lords, men of privilege and arms, whose castles loomed over the villages like reminders of power. The peasants worked the lord's domain fields, unpaid, for several days a week, and paid rent for their own small plots. They were bound by custom and by law. Most were villains, not quite slaves, but not free. They could not leave without permission, could not marry without consent, could not escape their birth. Still, there were limits to a lord's cruelty. A wise lord knew his wealth depended on his people's survival. Too harsh attacks, too many demands, and his fields would lie empty. Lords provided tools, grain loans, or protection from bandits, because without peasants, even the mightiest nobles starved. A restless world. Despite the hardships, the world of the peasant was not without joy. Festivals burst through the year like brief suns, midsummer fires, May dances, harvest feasts. Music drifted from taverns, laughter from the fields. Children played with carved wooden toys, women told stories by the hearth, men brewed ale from barley and honey. In the poorest hut there might still be a scrap of color, a painted cross, a woven charm, a candle burning before a saint's image. But beyond the laughter, beyond the smell of bread baking and wood smoke curling through the thatch, something was changing. Traders brought goods from far places, cloth from Flanders, spices from the east, coins stamped with strange kings' faces. Roads grew busier. Towns swelled with craftsmen and merchants. The old order was trembling, though no one yet knew why. And then came rumors, stories from the east, tales of sickness, of cities emptied overnight, of blackened corpses piled in the streets. Few peasants paid much heed. The east was another world, but the merchants who crossed the seas carried more than stories in their cargo. They carried death itself.
The Black Wind, when the plague came riding. It began far away, beyond the edges of maps peasants would never see. Somewhere in the dry steppes of Central Asia, where the air shimmered and the fleas hid in the fur of black rats, death found its first home. The merchants and soldiers who crossed those lands didn't know what rode with them, tiny, invisible, waiting. The Silk Road, once a golden thread of trade and culture, became a dark artery carrying a sickness that would soon bleed across the world. By the late 1340s, the Black Death, as it would later be called, had reached the heart of Europe. Ships came into harbors from the east, Genoa, Venice, Marseille, carrying goods, sailors, and rats. The rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried Yersinia pestis, a name no peasant would ever know, but one that would change every life in Christendom. The first signs were small. A merchant's apprentice in a port city fell ill. A beggar coughed blood into the dust. Then the bells began to toll. Within weeks, the disease swept inland along trade routes and rivers, creeping into the countryside like a black wind no prayer could stop. The arrival. For peasants, it came without warning. One day the fields were full of laughter and the whir of scythes. The next, the village reeve was dead. The symptoms were terrifying: sudden fever,
black swellings in the armpits and groin, the stench of rot from living flesh. Some lingered in agony for days, others dropped dead where they stood. It spared no one, young or old, rich or poor, priest or plowman. In small thatched cottages, families huddled together, whispering psalms. Mothers crossed themselves over their children. Fathers dug graves for their own kin. The churchyards filled so quickly that bodies had to be buried in mass pits, covered hastily with lime and earth. Even priests refused to come near. The smell of death hung over the fields like fog. To the peasants, it felt like the end of the world. They had seen famine, war, and hardship, but never this. The great famine had starved them. This new terror consumed them. They called it the Great Mortality, believing it was the wrath of God for their sins. Processions wound through villages, people flogging themselves with whips, begging for divine mercy. Kyrie eleison, they chanted, Lord, have mercy. But the heavens stayed silent. Faith and fear. Church bells that once marked hours of prayer now tolled endlessly for the dead. Priests read funeral rites over hundreds in a single day. Some clergy fled their posts, others stayed and perished among their flock. In monasteries, monks kept meticulous records, grim lists of the dead, until they too fell to the pestilence. Faith, once the bedrock of peasant life, began to crack. If God was merciful, why did he send such horror? Some believed it was punishment for pride and greed. Others blamed outsiders, Jews, foreigners, or even witches. In the panic, mobs rose and persecution followed. Across parts of Europe, communities turned on one another, desperate for someone to blame. Yet, in the darkest corners, faith endured. Peasants still lit candles before crude wooden crosses, still whispered prayers as they lay dying. In some villages, women gathered to sing hymns at sunset, their voices trembling but defiant, a fragile thread of hope in a collapsing world. The vanishing world. When death passed through a village, it left silence behind. Fields lay untended, mills stopped turning, and livestock wandered freely. Roads were empty except for carts piled high with corpses. Entire hamlets vanished. Chroniclers wrote of wolves prowling through abandoned towns, of churches where only the wind sang through the rafters. In England alone, nearly half the population may have died. In parts of France and Italy, whole regions were stripped of life. To the peasants who survived, the world must have seemed unrecognizable, a hollow shell of what once was. But even amid despair, life stirred stubbornly on. A handful of survivors in each village clung to existence. They buried their dead, cleaned the wells, burned the straw, and waited for the plague to pass. And it did eventually, slowly, unevenly, like a tide drawing back. By the early 1350s, the worst was over. The black wind had blown itself out, but it had changed everything it touched. Aftermath of the Black Death. Those who survived awoke to a new world. Entire families were gone. Fields lay fallow, villages empty. Yet where death had taken, opportunity crept in. There were fewer mouths to feed and fewer hands to work. Suddenly, the value of a peasant's labor rose. Landlords, desperate for workers, began to offer wages or better terms. For the first time, the poorest of the poor could bargain. In England, peasants left their manors in search of better pay, moving to new lands or towns. The old feudal order, where every man owed service and rent to his lord, began to tremble.
Knowledge through suffering. The survivors were not the same as those who came before. They had seen too much. The plague taught them grim lessons about the fragility of life and the limits of power. They no longer believed their lords or priests could save them. In many villages, common sense replaced superstition. People learned to avoid crowded markets, to cleanse houses with vinegar, to isolate the sick. It was the birth of a crude peasant medicine, born not of books, but of experience and loss. And perhaps the strangest thing of all, life went on. Children were born. The fields were sown again. The survivors sang new songs, darker but wiser. The memory of the Black Death would linger in Europe's bones for generations, shaping everything from art to faith to rebellion. But for the peasants who lived through it, survival itself was victory enough. The resilient few. Imagine them now, the few who remained in a half-empty world. A widow standing in a field that once belonged to 10 families. A boy leading oxen through weeds that had grown wild over the furrows. The church bell still rings, though there is no priest to answer it. Life, stubborn and miraculous, begins again. The peasants, once bound by fear and feudal chains, have glimpsed something extraordinary. A life less ruled by their lords, more their own. They did not yet know it, but the Black Death had planted the seeds of a revolution, not of swords and banners, but of wages, freedom, and dignity. The plague had burned the old world to ash, and from that ash, a new order would slowly rise.
Hunger and hope, life after the plague. When the bells finally stopped tolling and the smoke of burning homes faded into the horizon, the survivors stepped out into a world that no longer felt like their own. The air seemed cleaner, quieter, but too quiet, as though even the birds had forgotten how to sing. The Black Death had passed, but it had taken half of Europe with it. Villages were hollowed shells, cities scarred with grief, fields stood wild, thick with weeds. And yet, in that silence, something remarkable began to stir, life itself. A new beginning. For centuries, peasants had been chained to the land, bound by duty to their lords. But now, those chains had rusted. Where once a dozen families worked a field, only 2 or 3 remained. Lords, desperate to see their lands tended again, offered better terms. Men who had once worked without pay now demanded coin. Women who had lost husbands stepped into roles once denied to them, plowing, trading, even managing small holdings. The old order, so rigid and immovable, began to bend. Some lords tried to keep control. They issued decrees fixing wages, forbidding peasants from leaving the manor. In England, the Statute of Laborers in 1351 declared that no man should earn more than he did before the plague. But words on parchment could not fill empty fields. Peasants left anyway, seeking work wherever they pleased. For the first time, movement, freedom was within reach. A young plowman could now walk to a neighboring shire, find an abandoned holding and make it his own. Entire families resettled ghost villages, rebuilding cottages from ruins. They planted wheat again, sang harvest songs again, and slowly the land began to breathe. The weight of memory. But the wounds were deep. Survivors carried ghosts with them. They had buried fathers, mothers, children. In many villages, half the parish registers ended abruptly in a single year. The churchyards were full, but so were the hearts of the living. Faith itself had changed. The church had promised protection, yet priests had fled. Monasteries had locked their gates. The survivors turned their prayers inward, quieter, more personal. Pilgrimages declined. Superstition grew. People wore charms of herbs and bones, whispered blessings before every meal. God still ruled heaven, but on earth, the peasants had learned to trust themselves. And yet, despite their losses, there was gratitude. A simple bowl of pottage, a loaf of bread, a newborn's cry, these became sacred sounds of survival. The poorest of the poor, who had known only suffering, began to sense a strange, fragile hope. The price of emptiness. Still, survival had a cost. With so many dead, entire trades vanished. Millers, blacksmiths, carpenters, gone. Tools rusted, mills fell silent, roads crumbled, markets were half empty. For a time, gold meant nothing if there were no hands to build, no backs to carry, no hearts to trust. The great estates of nobles and bishops fell into disrepair, roofs leaked, barns rotted. Many lords, ruined by the loss of labor, sold land to the very peasants who once worked it. Ownership shifted, slowly and quietly, like the turning of the soil. And while famine no longer stalked every season, hunger never vanished. The climate still punished the weak. Crops failed, livestock died, and storms swept through like omens. But now, hunger came with defiance, not despair. Peasants had endured worse. They had seen death itself and lived. Women of the fields. The plague had also changed the place of women. With men dead or gone, widows took up plows, brewed ale, sold wares at market. In some places, they managed small farms independently, a rarity before the plague. Records show women petitioning manorial courts for property rights, signing contracts, and hiring laborers of their own. For the first time, the village economy began to hum with a quieter, subtler equality. Life demanded it. Necessity broke barriers that tradition had built for centuries. A chronicler from Norfolk wrote, "Women do now take upon them the labor of men, and none say them nay." They didn't call it progress, but in their quiet, enduring way, the peasant women of post-plague Europe were rewriting the laws of survival.
Lords in decline. The nobles, for their part, faced an unfamiliar enemy, scarcity. Without peasants to work their lands, their wealth withered. Once proud knights rode past empty villages, unable to collect rents that no one could pay. Even great abbeys, swollen with estates and tithes, found their coffers thinning. Some resorted to force. Armed men were sent to drag back runaway serfs, to enforce the old duties. But rebellion brewed in the silence, in whispers by the hearth, in taverns after dark. Peasants began to question why they should serve at all. Why should a man toil for another's profit when his own hands could feed him just as well? These questions, small, dangerous, and new, spread like embers through the countryside. It would take decades for them to ignite, but the spark had been struck. The slow return of laughter. As the decades passed, the rhythms of life resumed. Children once again played in the meadows, chasing each other between graves that had long since grown over with wildflowers. Villages rebuilt their churches. Bells rang not for mourning, but for weddings. In many places, the survivors built memorial crosses, simple stones carved with the year the plague came or the names of those lost. They didn't speak of it often. The pain was too heavy, but they remembered, always. The art and music of the time became steeped in that memory. Church frescoes showed skeletons dancing beside kings, the danse macabre, a grim reminder that death spared no one. But in those same murals, peasants appeared too, dancing, working, laughing, as if to say, "We lived, and that is enough." Hope in the soil. By the end of the 14th century, Europe's population was smaller but stronger. Food was more plentiful, wages higher, and health, though fragile, better than before. The same soil that had swallowed millions now gave birth to a new kind of prosperity. The survivors' children would never forget the lessons written in suffering, that no lord, no priest, and no king could command the harvests of life and death, that the land belonged to those who worked it, that hope, once rooted, grows back through any storm. The peasants had survived famine and plague, and now they were learning something revolutionary. They could thrive.
Chains and uprising.
when peasants rebelled. The Black Death had broken more than bodies. It had broken the old order. In the empty years that followed, Europe's fields grew green again, its bells rang again, and the living carried on. But something deep within the peasants had changed. They had seen their lords beg for labor, their priests flee from death, and the power of kings fail to save even themselves. Once, peasants had bowed out of habit. Now, they bowed because they chose to, and choice, even in small things, was a dangerous seed. The roots of restlessness. The years after the plague were full of quiet rebellion. Across England, France, and the Low Countries, peasants began to test their limits. They asked for higher wages, refused to perform unpaid labor, and walked away from manors whose lords demanded too much. For a time, the rulers tried to turn back the clock. In England, King Edward III's Statute of Laborers made it illegal for workers to ask for more pay or leave their villages. In France, taxes multiplied to fund endless wars. And everywhere, new officials were sent to remind peasants of their place. But the peasants remembered hunger and plague. They remembered digging graves for those who once commanded them. They no longer believed that order was divine. They knew it was human, and humans could bleed. Whispers spread along the dusty roads. If all men are God's children, why are some born to serve? The sparks in the fields. The spark came first in France. In 1358, the peasants of northern France rose up in fury. The land had been ravaged by the 100 Years' War, the soldiers of both armies plundering and burning villages. When the nobles demanded more taxes and more men, the peasants refused. They took up whatever they could, pitchforks, clubs, flails, and turned against the manor houses. The uprising became known as the Jacquerie, from the mocking name Jacques Bonhomme, the lord's term for any common peasant. But the name they mocked became a banner of pride. For a few weeks, the countryside burned with revolt. Castles were attacked, lords slain, manorial records destroyed, the written proof of centuries of bondage. The rebellion was brutally crushed. Thousands of peasants were executed, but the fire, once lit, would not go out. England's storm. 2 decades later, across the Channel, another storm was gathering. England, too, was weary of plague, of taxes, of endless wars in France. The kings needed money, and they found it in the peasants' pockets. A new poll tax was introduced, the same amount for every man, no matter how poor. It was the spark. In the summer of 1381, in the county of Essex, tax collectors arrived and demanded payment from villagers who had nothing left to give. The peasants refused. The officials pressed harder. Violence followed, and suddenly the countryside was in flames. From village to village, word spread like wildfire. "Enough," they cried. Men armed with scythes and cudgels gathered under makeshift banners. A humble priest, John Ball, became their voice, preaching equality before God. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was a question that shook the kingdom. The march to London. Tens of thousands of peasants marched towards London. They came barefoot and ragged, but with purpose. Their leader, Wat Tyler, rode at their head. Along the way, they opened prisons, burned legal records, and demanded an end to serfdom, the freedom to work and live where they wished. As they entered the city, the gates opened to them, for even many townsfolk sympathized with their cause. They destroyed symbols of oppression, including the hated poll tax records. For a moment, the unthinkable happened. The peasants ruled England's capital. Then came the meeting with the young King Richard II at Mailand. The king, only 14 years old, promised reforms, freedom, and forgiveness. The peasants believed him. But when Wat Tyler met the king again at Smithfield to press for more, a royal officer struck him down. The rebellion collapsed in chaos. Thousands were hunted, tried, and executed. Yet the promises made at Mailand were never entirely forgotten.
The dream that wouldn't die. Though both the Jacquerie in France and the peasants' revolt in England were defeated, they marked a turning point in European history. The ruling class had seen the impossible, the common people united, armed, and unafraid. The rebels' dreams outlived their bodies. The idea that a man's worth came not from birth, but from labor, began to take root. Slowly, across the next century, serfdom weakened. Lords found it harder to hold their peasants in bondage. Free laborers and tenant farmers became the new backbone of rural life. Even the church could not ignore the change. Preachers began to speak of charity and justice, not just obedience. In some regions, monasteries sold land directly to peasants, creating small but independent communities. The world that rose from the ashes of plague and rebellion was harsher, but also more awake. Lessons in fire. The uprisings failed in the short term, but they burned a message into history that endurance can become defiance, and defiance can become change. The peasants who once survived famine and plague had learned the final lesson: how to survive their lords. The very people who had been dismissed as voiceless and powerless became the quiet architects of a new society. They didn't overthrow kings, not yet, but they cracked the foundations of feudalism. By the 15th century, in many corners of Europe, a peasant could own his land, set his price, and choose his work. It was a small revolution, built not in battles, but in harvests and contracts. The age of blind obedience was ending. The age of labor and reason was beginning. And in the fields, where once death had walked in shadow, life, stubborn, green, and human, had taken root again. The long harvest. How peasants shaped the modern world. By the dawn of the 15th century, Europe had changed beyond recognition. The shadows of the Black Death still lingered in memory, but from those shadows, new life had begun to grow. Villages once empty now hummed again with laughter and work. The peasants, once voiceless and bound by chains of duty, had learned something powerful, that endurance itself could become strength. The end of feudal chains. The old world of serfdom had been cracked open. Lords, weakened by war, debt, and the loss of labor, could no longer hold their peasants as before. Across England, France, and parts of Germany, the manorial system slowly faded. The language of obligation, of rent, service, and fealty gave way to the language of wages and contracts. A new class emerged, the free laborer. These were peasants who rented land for coin, chose where they would work, and negotiated their worth. Their fathers had been tied to the soil. They were tied only to their ambition. For the first time in centuries, the peasants' hands could feed their own dreams. Innovation in the fields. With freedom came creativity. Peasants began experimenting with their crops, rotating fields between grain, legumes, and pasture to keep the soil rich. They bred stronger oxen, built sturdier plows, and shared new tools from region to region. In Flanders and northern Italy,
Smallholders began producing surplus crops to sell at market. Villages became small economies of trade. Cheese, wool, honey, ale, pottery. What had once been survival slowly turned into progress. Even the rhythm of labor changed. Instead of working under a lord's eye, peasants began to manage their own time, balancing toil with rest, prayer, and family. The village, once a symbol of hardship, became a symbol of quiet independence. From fields to towns. As trade expanded, many peasants moved toward towns. The children of plowmen became bakers, weavers, and masons. They carried with them the discipline of the land, patience, endurance, and community. Those values became the backbone of Europe's growing towns and guilds. The skills of ordinary people, once ignored by history, laid the foundation for Europe's later prosperity. Without the steady hands of peasants who rebuilt the land after plague and famine, there would have been no Renaissance, no thriving cities, no rediscovery of art and learning. The rebirth of Europe was not born in palaces, it began in the furrows of the earth. A new relationship with the land. And even nature seemed to reward them. By the late 1400s, the climate warmed again and harvests became more reliable. Markets grew busier. Families began to build stone houses in place of timber huts. Windows widened, fields widened. The peasant's world, though still humble, was brighter. A man could now hope that his son might own a full acre, that his daughter might learn to read from the parish priest. The dream of stability, once unthinkable, had taken root. The peasant's legacy. The peasants of the Middle Ages never thought of themselves as heroes. They didn't write chronicles or paint their victories. Yet their endurance had done something extraordinary. By surviving plague, famine, and oppression, they had carried civilization through its darkest centuries. Their quiet strength reshaped the moral fabric of Europe. The idea that hard work and perseverance could lift a man's station, that worth was earned, not inherited, was born in those muddy fields. Centuries later, that same spirit would fuel revolutions, reformations, and the rise of democracy itself. The long harvest of peasant endurance would feed generations to come. The quiet triumph. As night falls over a medieval village, the glow of hearths flickering against the dark, you can almost hear the echoes of that triumph. A woman baking bread, a man sharpening his plow, a child whispering a prayer. They were ordinary lives, lived in extraordinary times. And though they never knew it, the peasants who survived plague and famine had done more than save themselves. They had sown the seeds of the modern world.
Echoes through time, the legacy of survival. The story of the medieval peasant did not end with the closing of the Middle Ages. Though their names were lost, their spirit echoed through the centuries. In every village rebuilt, every field reclaimed, every nation reborn from hardship. The peasants who once bent their backs beneath famine and plague became the silent architects of the modern world. From silence to symbol. For hundreds of years, the common people of the Middle Ages had no voice in chronicles or poetry. The scribes wrote of kings and knights, of saints and wars. Yet as Europe's memory deepened, the peasant emerged not as a figure of pity, but of quiet strength. Artists of the Renaissance painted them in golden fields, stooped but serene. Writers spoke of their simple faith, their loyalty to the earth. In the centuries that followed, the image of the peasant became a symbol of endurance, humility, and truth. They represented the heartbeat of civilization, the people who worked not for glory, but for life itself. Faith and the human spirit. The peasants' faith had been born from suffering, and it endured long after their hardships eased. Their prayers were not for conquest or power, but for rain, for bread, for the safety of their children. This humble spirituality shaped Europe's conscience. As monasteries faded and cathedrals grew, the heart of religion moved closer to the people. Parish priests preached in local tongues. Hymns were sung in the fields as much as in churches. The idea that God was found not in marble halls, but in daily labor, came from the peasant world. Their belief that holiness could live in ordinary lives, in plowing, baking, weaving, transformed Western faith into something deeply human. The rise of the common man. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was no longer a land ruled solely by birth. Markets, towns, and learning expanded. The sons of peasants became craftsmen, merchants, even scholars. Education, once a privilege of the clergy, began to reach the countryside. In England, yeoman farmers, free peasants who owned their own land, became a powerful class, independent and proud. In France, smallholders laid the foundation for a rural culture that would later fuel revolution. The habits born of hardship, thrift, endurance, cooperation, became the moral backbone of the Western world. From their long endurance came new ideals: work as dignity, freedom as necessity, community as strength. In art and memory. Even centuries later, their image never vanished. In paintings by Pieter Bruegel, peasants danced, harvested, and feasted under broad skies, not noble or royal, but vividly alive. Their laughter, their toil, their humanity were celebrated as the essence of Europe. In literature, too, their world endured. From Chaucer's Canterbury Tales to later novels of the countryside, the simple peasant became a mirror of the soul, honest, enduring, flawed, yet unbreakable. The modern fascination with folk culture, songs, and proverbs all trace back to them, the wisdom of those who had little but made life rich anyway. Lessons carried forward. The peasant's story is not just a tale of the past. It holds lessons for every generation that faces hardship. They lived through disasters that seemed absolute: plague, famine, war, oppression, and yet they rebuilt. Their secret was simple: persistence over despair, work over fear, faith over ruin. Even in the 21st century, their legacy endures in the values societies prize most: labor, fairness, resilience. Every farmer tending the soil, every worker shaping the world with their hands, walks in the shadow of those medieval survivors. The common man of history was never common at all. He was the foundation. The eternal harvest. As we look back across 7 centuries, it becomes clear that the medieval peasant's struggle was not in vain. They did more than feed empires. They sustained humanity itself. Each seed they planted, each wall they rebuilt, each song they sang against the silence of death became a thread in the fabric of civilization. History remembers kings in marble, but it lives through the hands of peasants in soil. Their legacy is quiet, but eternal, a harvest that still ripens in every generation.
From fields to freedom, the dawn of a new world. As the 15th century faded into the 16th, Europe began to awaken from its long medieval slumber. The once bound peasants, whose ancestors had bowed before famine and plague, now stood taller than ever before. The soil that had once chained them became the very ground of their liberation. From the ashes of death and despair, they had built the foundations of a new world, a world that would slowly give birth to freedom, knowledge, and the modern spirit. The slow death of feudalism. The feudal order, once unshakable, began to crumble like an old fortress left to rot. The lords who had ruled through fear and privilege found themselves weakened by economic change. The Black Death had not only killed people, it had broken systems. With labor scarce and fields untended, peasants discovered something powerful. They could negotiate. A lord could no longer demand endless service when workers were few. Peasants began to ask for wages instead of servitude, contracts instead of chains. Across England and France, in the Low Countries and Germany, this quiet revolution spread. The land that had once owned them now had to be earned from them. The birth of a new economy. The medieval world had been a world of survival. The New World was becoming one of trade. Markets expanded as goods flowed from villages to cities. Wool, grain, and timber were traded for coin, and coin meant choice, something peasants had never truly known before. In England, small landholders called yeomen flourished. They were no longer serfs, but independent farmers who managed their own estates and employed laborers. In Italy and Flanders, peasant families turned into merchants, their sons learning letters and numbers to handle trade. The spirit of enterprise, once reserved for nobles and guildsmen, began to stir in the countryside. It was the quiet beginning of capitalism, born not in royal courts, but in muddy fields. Rebellion and reform. Freedom, however, did not come without struggle. Even as peasants gained ground, old powers fought to keep them beneath their boots. Taxes rose, rents were raised, and new laws tried to restore the old order. But the people had tasted strength, and they would not forget it. From the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 to the German Peasants' War of 1525, the countryside shook with rebellion. Thousands took up pitchforks and scythes, not merely to survive, but to demand justice. Though most uprisings were crushed, their message echoed through the centuries. The common man would no longer bow without reason. Every revolt was a seed, and in time, those seeds grew into revolutions far greater. Education and enlightenment. As printing spread through Europe, even the humblest households began to hear new ideas. Books, pamphlets, and prayers were translated into common tongues. For the first time, peasants could read scripture for themselves, question authority, and imagine a life beyond obedience. This new hunger for knowledge broke the monopoly of the church and the nobility. The same spirit that once drove peasants to survive famine now drove them to seek understanding. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, even the idea of human rights all trace part of their roots back to that awakening of the common mind. The medieval peasants' endurance had matured into curiosity, and curiosity became freedom. The seeds of democracy. By the 17th century, Europe had begun to talk of liberty, and behind those words lay centuries of toil by nameless men and women. The peasant who once bowed before his lord now voted in village councils, joined militias, and debated taxes. The principles that would later inspire revolutions in England, France, and beyond were born in those modest communities that once fought for bread and dignity. Freedom was no longer a dream whispered in the fields. It was a force shaping nations. The peasant's gift to the world. It is tempting to see history as the story of kings and conquerors, but the truth is simpler and deeper. Without the perseverance of peasants, their endless labor, their refusal to vanish, civilization itself might have perished. They endured the darkest centuries and taught the world that survival can be victory. From them came the work ethic that built economies, the compassion that softened religion, and the courage that fed revolutions. Their gift to history was not wealth or art. It was the proof that ordinary lives could shape extraordinary destinies. A world reborn. By the dawn of the modern era, the medieval peasant had vanished in name but not in spirit. He had become the citizen, the worker, the farmer, the craftsman, the maker of nations. The same hands that once clutched a wooden plow now built ships, cities, and empires. The same hearts that once trembled before famine now dared to imagine freedom. And thus, from the furrows of the medieval field grew the roots of the modern world, a world sown by those who refuse to die.
The forgotten voices, remembering the peasants today. History has a strange memory. It loves crowns, it adores battles, it worships monuments, yet it often forgets the hands that built them. The medieval peasants, whose sweat fed empires and whose endurance carried humanity through plague and famine, became ghosts in the chronicles of kings. But every field once plowed, every village once rebuilt, every melody sung under the moonlight still whispers their name. Though time has stolen their words, their story continues, not written in ink, but in the heartbeat of the world they left behind. The vanishing of the common man. When Europe emerged from the Middle Ages, the narrative of progress quickly focused on explorers, scientists, and monarchs. The peasants, who had formed 90% of the population for centuries, slipped quietly out of sight. They were seen as background, faceless laborers, part of the landscape rather than its shapers. The Renaissance celebrated art and intellect. The Enlightenment praised philosophy and politics. But few paused to ask, who fed the thinkers? Who built the cities? Who endured while others dreamed? For centuries, the answer lay buried, literally beneath the soil they once tilled. Digging up the past. In the 20th and 21st centuries, archaeologists and social historians began to listen for those forgotten voices. From the remains of cottages, tools, and even ancient footprints, they pieced together a lost civilization of endurance. Tiny shards of pottery, plow blades, seeds preserved in ancient granaries, all told the story of ordinary people living extraordinary resilience. These discoveries showed that medieval peasants were not passive victims of history, but innovators and survivors. Their villages revealed complex community systems, shared wells, collective storage, and democratic decision-making long before the modern age claimed such ideals. The lessons of survival. The peasants' lives were not easy. They worked from dawn until dusk, often barefoot in mud, fearing drought one year and plague the next. Yet they built bonds of cooperation stronger than iron. When famine struck, they shared what little they had. When lords demanded impossible taxes, they gathered in quiet defiance. Their survival was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, communal. Modern societies, fractured by isolation and competition, can still learn from that unity. The peasant's endurance teaches us that survival depends not only on strength, but on solidarity. They had no armies, no wealth,
no power, yet they endured the fall of kingdoms and the death of half the known world. That, in itself, is civilization's greatest miracle. The peasant spirit in the modern world. Look closely and you'll still see the medieval peasant everywhere. In the farmer who rises before dawn to tend a field, in the factory worker who keeps an economy moving, in the refugee who rebuilds life from ruin. The same courage that kept a 14th century villager alive through plague keeps humanity alive today through crisis and change. The world may have swapped scythes for machines, but the struggle and the strength remain the same. In rural Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and in the Americas, millions still live by rhythms older than history, the rhythm of seed, harvest, and hope. Each of them is an echo of that medieval endurance. Rediscovering dignity. As modern historians revisit the Middle Ages, the peasant is finally being restored to his rightful place, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. Museums now display the daily lives of villagers with reverence once reserved for nobility. Universities study the social systems of medieval communities to understand sustainability and resilience. Even popular culture, films, novels, and games now portray peasants not as background, but as protagonists in their own stories. To remember them is to remember the true cost of civilization and the quiet power of the people who built it. The eternal thread. Every time a storm breaks over a field and a farmer looks up at the sky with hope instead of fear, the legacy of the medieval peasant lives again. Every time a community stands together against hardship, their spirit returns. They remind us that history is not only written in palaces, but in cottages, not only sung by poets, but whispered by the poor. Their story is not over, because we are living it still. Every act of endurance, every gesture of kindness, every small victory in the face of despair is part of that same unbroken thread stretching back through time. And perhaps that is the greatest tribute we can offer them, not monuments or statues, but the simple act of remembering that humanity has always been strongest in its humblest hearts.
The seeds of tomorrow. What the Middle Age world taught us about survival. When we look back at the long, dark centuries of the Middle Ages, it is tempting to see them as a distant, primitive time, a world of superstition and suffering. Yet beneath the shadow of plague and oppression, medieval peasants carried within them something timeless, the art of survival. Their world was fragile, but their spirit was unbreakable. And in an age when humanity again faces pandemics, inequality, and ecological crisis, their story feels eerily close, like a mirror held across 700 years. Echoes of the plague. In the 21st century, as the world battled the COVID-19 pandemic, historians often drew comparisons to the Black Death. The same fear, isolation, and uncertainty returned, though with modern medicine instead of medieval prayer. Yet the emotional truth remained unchanged. People needed connection, compassion, and courage to endure. The medieval peasants, cut off in their small villages, had no doctors, no hospitals, no government aid. What they had was each other. They survived because communities shared food, cared for the sick, buried the dead, and rebuilt together when it was over. In the end, their survival came not from power, but from solidarity, a lesson as urgent today as it was in the 14th century.
The wisdom of simplicity. Modern society often measures progress in speed, consumption, and wealth. But the medieval peasant lived by a slower rhythm, one that understood the balance between humans and the land. They knew that soil needed rest, that nature's cycles could not be rushed, that hunger taught gratitude, and that life depended on cooperation more than competition. In a time when the earth again groans under the weight of industry and greed, the peasant's wisdom offers quiet guidance. Respect the land, take only what you need, and remember that all life is connected. Their simplicity was not ignorance, it was harmony. Resilience in the face of ruin. What truly defined the peasants was not what they suffered, but how they responded. When plagues wiped out villages, they rebuilt. When lords demanded impossible rents, they protested. When harvests failed, they adapted. Every generation of peasants faced catastrophe, and yet every generation endured. Today's world faces crises of its own: war, climate change, inequality. And yet the same virtues that once saved medieval Europe, endurance, cooperation, and faith, remain the keys to human survival. The peasants' lives remind us that history's greatest victories often belong not to conquerors, but to survivors. Community, the heart of survival. In medieval Europe, the village was more than a place. It was a lifeline. Families shared tools, fields, and even children's care. Work was collective, and celebration was shared. When one family fell, the village raised them up. Modern life has traded that closeness for independence and often loneliness. But when global crises strike, from pandemics to natural disasters, humanity returns to what the peasants always knew: that no one survives alone. Their model of community, imperfect yet deeply human, shows us the path forward. To survive tomorrow's challenges, we must rebuild not just systems, but relationships. The moral legacy. Beyond the physical struggle to survive, medieval peasants left behind a moral legacy: dignity in labor, humility before nature, and faith in life's renewal. They believed that every season of despair was followed by a harvest, if one only endured long enough to see it. That faith was not religious alone. It was a worldview born of hardship. It said, the world breaks, and we mend it. It said, we are small, but together we are strong. In a fragmented, uncertain modern world, that belief might be the most vital seed they pass down. Planting the future. The story of the medieval peasants is not just about the past. It's a reminder that survival is a continuous act of creation. Each generation inherits both the scars and the strength of those who came before. When we rebuild after disaster, when we share rather than hoard, when we find beauty in small things, we live as they once did. We become part of their unbroken chain of survival, stretching from the 14th century to the future. They taught us that civilization is not measured by wealth or walls, but by the courage to keep sowing hope after loss. And so, even now, as we stand at the edge of new challenges, we carry the peasant's greatest gift: the stubborn, sacred belief that no winter lasts forever, and that from the darkest soil, life always grows again.
Epilogue. The hands that built humanity. There are no statues for them. No marble memorials rise in their honor. Their names were never carved in royal halls or written in gilded books. Yet every road we walk, every city we live in, every loaf of bread we eat
bears the invisible mark of their hands, the medieval peasants who survived plague, famine, and oppression, and in doing so, kept the light of humanity alive. This is their quiet, eternal monument. The unwritten heroes of history. History tends to remember brilliance, kings, scholars, conquerors, but it was built upon endurance. While nobles fought their wars and philosophers debated in cloisters, it was the peasants who sustained the world. When plague decimated populations, they returned to the fields. When famine struck, they shared the last loaf. When injustice rose, they endured until change came. They were not saints or heroes in the epic sense, but they carried a holiness of their own, the sacredness of ordinary life, lived with courage in the face of endless trial. Their story is proof that civilization's greatest strength does not come from power, but from persistence. The world they left behind. When the last great plague faded and the medieval world began to evolve, it did so on the foundation they had laid. Their tools became the basis for industry. Their songs became the roots of folk culture. Their village councils inspired the idea of local governance. They left behind no treasures, only traditions, of hard work, of cooperation, of hope passed quietly from one generation to the next. In the centuries that followed, when Europe rose into the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Age, the spirit of those peasants still lingered like the heartbeat beneath history's surface. Without them, there would have been no rebirth, no progress, no modern world. The human thread. If we trace the lineage of endurance through time, we find that it never breaks. The medieval farmer, the industrial worker, the modern laborer, they are one and the same spirit, reborn in different forms. It is the same pair of hands that sows wheat in the medieval field, that forges steel in a 19th century factory, that types code in a 21st century office. Technology changes, but toil remains. The world evolves, but survival, that ancient art, stays constant. And each time humanity faces darkness, we rediscover the strength that once kept medieval peasants alive through centuries of despair. What they taught us. From them we inherited more than survival. We inherited meaning. They taught us that every life, no matter how humble, contributes to the great story of mankind. That dignity does not come from status, but from effort. That hope is not luxury, but necessity. Their resilience became the blueprint for modern humanity's courage. Their suffering became its conscience. Their endurance became its soul. We live in towers of glass and light, but the foundation beneath them is still made of earth, the same earth they once turned, the same soil that holds their bones and their memory. The eternal harvest. In the grand arc of history, kingdoms fall, empires vanish, inventions grow obsolete, but the spirit of the peasant, the will to endure, to build, to believe, remains indestructible. Even now, in every farmer's field, every worker's sweat, every mother's prayer, that ancient rhythm continues. Sow, struggle, survive, hope. The peasants never sought glory, yet they achieved immortality, not through conquest, but through contribution. They are the quiet architects of humanity. Closing reflection. If you stand today in a European meadow at dusk, you can still feel it, that ancient heartbeat beneath the soil. The wind that once carried the cries of famine now hums with peace. The same land that witnessed despair now grows abundance. And somewhere in that silence, you might almost hear them, the forgotten millions, whispering through the centuries.
Before the storm. Life in the medieval fields. Before the world was torn apart by plague and hunger, there was peace, a fragile, hard-working kind of peace that hung over the medieval countryside like morning mist. Across the rolling fields of England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, peasants lived close to the soil. Their lives were small but steady, shaped by the rhythm of sunrise, prayer, and toil. Each dawn, the bells from the village church called men and women to labor. They plowed the Lord's lands first, the demesne fields, before tending their own narrow strips of earth. Their homes were thatched with straw, their walls made of mud and timber, and their lives bound by seasons. Birth, work, marriage, and death all took place within a few square miles of soil. The peasants' world was ruled by lords who claimed both land and power. The lord's manor stood high on a hill, a symbol of authority. In exchange for protection, peasants owed him labor and taxes. They had to grind grain at his mill, bake bread in his oven, and pay a portion of every harvest. Even the forest, the streams, and the game within them were his property. A poor man caught hunting a deer might lose his hand for it. Yet despite this cruel system, the villages were full of life. On Sundays, the peasants gathered for Mass, the only day free from fieldwork. After prayers, they would share ale, sing, and tell stories of saints in faraway lands. Life was hard, but it had a rhythm. People knew their place in the order of things. Children worked young, carrying water, feeding animals, gathering sticks. Women rose before dawn to bake, mend, and care for livestock. Men bent over their plows until their backs ached, but still managed to joke and sing as they worked. Hope was humble, a good harvest, a healthy baby, or mercy from the local priest. But beneath this calm, a shadow was growing. The population of Europe was swelling fast. Too many mouths, not enough food. Crops began to fail in colder years, and the prices of grain rose. By the early 1300s, whispers of hunger spread from village to village. People spoke of strange weather, of cold summers and endless rain. They could not know it yet, but these were the first signs of something far greater, the coming storm. The lords grew rich on rent and labor, while peasants lived one bad harvest away from ruin. The feudal contract, once stable, began to crack. When families couldn't pay, they lost their land and became serfs, bound permanently to the soil. To survive, some fled to nearby towns, hoping to find freedom as craftsmen or servants. But most stayed, trapped by duty and fear. Still, the peasants endured. They shared what little they had, helped neighbors in need, and clung to faith. The church told them that their suffering was God's will, and obedience their path to heaven. So they prayed harder, worked longer, and endured quietly. But destiny had other plans. The fragile order of the medieval world, the fields, the lords, the prayers, would soon be tested by forces no one could imagine. A pestilence was moving west from Asia, silent and unstoppable. Within a few years, the same fields that now shimmered with wheat would be overgrown with weeds and silence. The peasants who had toiled so faithfully for centuries were about to face the greatest trial in human history, a storm of death, hunger, and revolt. The age of innocence was ending, and the age of survival was about to begin.
The Black Wind, when the plague arrived. It began with whispers, a sickness in the east, a curse that rode the trade winds from faraway lands. No one believed it at first, but by the time the ships docked at Genoa and Marseille in 1347, the Black Death had already arrived. For the peasants of Europe, the plague came like a shadow that no prayer could lift. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried death, and within weeks, entire villages fell silent. The bells that once called people to work now tolled only for funerals. At first, they thought it was a punishment from God. Priests preached repentance, urging people to confess their sins. Some whipped themselves in the streets, begging for mercy. But the sickness cared for neither piety nor power. It took the good and the wicked alike. Peasant homes became tombs. A mother would bury her child in the morning, only to fall ill by evening. The village priest who came to bless the dead would join them before dawn. Graves overflowed. In some places there were not enough living to bury the dead. Corpses were left in carts, stacked like sheaves of grain. The air itself seemed poisoned. People fled their homes, abandoning crops and animals. Whole manors stood empty, the lords and their families gone. The fields turned wild. Chickens wandered through silent streets. Wolves prowled the outskirts of abandoned villages. Yet in this horror, some peasants found a terrible kind of freedom. For the first time, there were more fields than hands to work them. Land that once belonged to lords lay untended. Survivors began to claim what was left: tools, homes, and plots of earth. But survival came at a price. Those who lived had to face a world without order. Food grew scarce as trade stopped. Mills stood idle. Markets vanished. The church, once the heart of every village, could no longer offer comfort. The priests were dead, the prayers unanswered. Still, the peasants endured. They buried their dead, they prayed in silence, and when the fever passed, they began to till the soil again. Out of ashes, life stubbornly returned. A few lords tried to reclaim their manors, but found the peasants changed. The survivors were no longer meek. They had seen death face to face and no longer feared it. They demanded better wages, more freedom, fairer treatment. When lords refused, peasants simply walked away, to new lands, to towns, to a different kind of life. The plague, for all its horror, had broken the chains of feudal order. The old world, built on obedience and hierarchy, began to crack. And yet the memory of death lingered. Every breeze that rustled through the wheat seemed to whisper of ghosts. They had survived the black wind, but their world would never be the same. The peasants who lived through it carried scars not only on their bodies, but in their souls. They had learned that kings and priests could not protect them, that even God's silence could not end their struggle. What remained was raw, simple endurance, the will to live, to rebuild, to plant again. From the ruins of the plague, a new kind of peasant would rise, one who knew his worth, who had faced the end of the world and kept on going. The black wind had swept across Europe, taking half of its people, but what it left behind was a seed, the beginning of change.
When the plague finally loosened its grip, the peasants thought the worst had passed. But what followed was another enemy: hunger. The earth itself seemed cursed, the skies refusing to bless the soil. From 1315 onward, Europe entered years of strange, cold weather and relentless rain. Crops failed, grain rotted in the fields, and famine crept like a second plague across the land. The survivors of disease now faced the slower death of starvation. Barns were empty, seed stores exhausted. Bread, once a simple comfort, became rare as gold. Families ground tree bark into powder to mix with flour. They boiled weeds, roots, and even leather to fill their bellies. The lords, safe within their manors, hoarded what little food remained. Peasants who could not pay rent or taxes lost their plots and were driven into the roads. Bands of starving men and women wandered from village to village, begging for food or work. Yet, even in despair, the peasants refused to give up. In every hamlet, there were moments of quiet heroism. A widow sharing her last loaf, a priest giving his portion to a child, a neighbor helping bury the dead when no one else could. The famine stripped life to its barest truth. Survival was not a solitary act, but a shared struggle. When trade routes broke down, peasants built small hidden gardens behind their cottages. They trapped rabbits, gathered herbs, fished in secret streams, even when it was forbidden by the Lord's law. Survival was rebellion, and rebellion became life. The church told them to pray, and they did. Every storm, every dark cloud became a test of faith. Pilgrims walked barefoot across muddy roads, begging the heavens for mercy. In monasteries, monks copied prayers for rain, while in villages, women knelt in fields holding handfuls of dead wheat, asking for forgiveness. But slowly, through hardship, something began to change. The peasants learned new ways to live with the land. They rotated crops, used manure to enrich the soil, and built ditches to drain the floodwater. They adapted because they had to. From the ashes of hunger rose innovation. Communities began to cooperate more closely. When one village starved, another shared. When one family fell sick, others tended their children. For the first time, peasants began to see themselves not only as servants of lords, but as guardians of one another. That bond, forged in hunger, would become their greatest strength in the centuries to come. By the late 1330s, the weather began to improve. Sunshine returned, fields turned golden again, and the first full harvest after years of famine brought tears to hardened faces. Bells rang across the countryside. It was not plenty, but it was life. In that moment, hope returned to Europe's soil. Yet beneath the joy lay a quiet truth. The peasants had survived not because of their lords, nor because of divine miracles, but because of their own hands and hearts. They had faced death in two forms, plague and hunger, and endured both. What once seemed unthinkable had become ordinary. Loss, grief, and endurance. That endurance changed them. The peasants who had once bowed without question now looked at their lords differently. The power that ruled from stone towers had proven fragile, while the strength that rose from the fields had proven eternal. The famine had taken nearly as many as the plague, but those who survived carried a fire within them, a faith in their own resilience. They would never forget what hunger had taught them, that the true wealth of the land was not gold or grain, but the will to endure and the compassion to share. And though the fields were green again, the world that emerged was no longer the same.
The soil of Europe had seen enough suffering, plague, famine, death, and yet it continued to demand sweat and sacrifice. But by the late 1300s, the peasants were no longer the same obedient hands that had bent quietly under the yoke of their lords. They had endured the worst disasters known to man and learned a terrible truth. Survival made them powerful. After the Black Death, so many had died that labor became scarce. The surviving peasants realized their worth. They could demand better wages, lighter taxes, even small freedoms once denied to them. But the lords and kings, greedy for control, refused to let go of their old privileges. To keep the peasants bound, new laws were written. In England, the Statute of Laborers, 1351, tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, forcing workers to accept whatever their masters offered. Those who refused could be branded as criminals. Similar edicts spread through France, Germany, and Italy. But the world had changed. Peasants were no longer willing to kneel. They had buried their families, endured hunger, and faced death itself. What was a lord's anger compared to that? Tension began to burn beneath the surface of the villages.
In taverns and markets, men whispered of justice. Priests, sympathetic to the poor, began preaching that all men were equal before God. One of them, John Ball, would later become the voice of rebellion, asking in a sermon that echoed across England, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" It was a question that shook the very foundation of feudal order. The spark of rebellion. The spark finally came in 1381. King Richard II of England, barely 15 years old, imposed a third poll tax to pay for his wars in France. For the peasants, this was the final insult. Tax collectors arrived, demanding coins from the poorest of homes, even from boys barely grown. When one collector assaulted a young girl in Essex, her father struck him down, and the flame was lit. Word spread like wildfire through the countryside. Farmers dropped their plows and picked up scythes and axes. Thousands marched toward London under banners of St. George, shouting for truth and freedom. They were led by men of the people: Wat Tyler, a soldier-turned-leader, John Ball, the rebellious priest, and countless nameless villagers who had nothing to lose. They moved like a tide, burning tax records, storming manors, and freeing prisoners along the way. By June, an army of commoners surrounded London. The ruling elite trembled. Inside the capital, the rebels met young King Richard at Mile End. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair wages, and the right to own land. Astonishingly, the boy king agreed. Hope surged through the crowd. Perhaps justice was finally near. But fate, as ever, was cruel. At a later meeting in Smithfield, Wat Tyler approached the king to finalize their victory. A royal officer insulted him, blades were drawn, and Tyler was struck down, murdered in front of his followers. The king, terrified, rode forward and lied to the rebels, promising peace if they disbanded. Trusting him, they withdrew. The rebellion was crushed within days. Its leaders were hunted and executed. John Ball was captured and hanged, his body displayed as a warning. The price and the legacy. The uprising had failed in arms, but not in spirit. The lords could kill men, but not ideas. Across Europe, the shock of the peasants' defiance spread like thunder. In France, Germany, and Flanders, similar revolts followed. The Jacquerie, the Tuchin revolts, the Ciompi uprising in Florence. Everywhere, the cry was the same: enough. The ruling class realized that the old order was no longer safe. Even the poorest man could rise if pushed too far. Slowly, painfully, feudalism began to weaken. Landlords started hiring free laborers instead of keeping serfs. The walls between classes cracked, letting in the first light of modern freedom. For the peasants who had marched and died, it was not victory, but it was the beginning of change. Their courage planted seeds that would, centuries later, grow into revolutions far greater than they could imagine. The world remembered them not as rebels, but as voices of justice born from suffering. The lords rebuilt their manors. The king ruled again, but in every field the whisper of defiance remained. Men who had once bowed now held their heads higher. Women who had hidden during famine now stood beside their husbands with equal resolve. The age of silent endurance was over. From the ashes of plague and hunger rose a new kind of strength, not the power of the sword, but the power of unity. The peasants had learned to survive together, to fight together, and to dream of something beyond mere survival: dignity.
The fields that once lay silent after plague and rebellion began to stir again. By the early 1400s, Europe's soil, soaked with both blood and tears, was slowly waking. The air smelled once more of turned earth
and ripening grain. Across the countryside, the peasants who had survived the nightmares of pestilence, hunger, and tyranny were ready to rebuild. But the world they rebuilt was not the same as before. The old feudal chains had weakened. Many lords were dead, their lineages extinguished by plague or rebellion. Vacant lands needed hands, and those who had once been serfs became tenants, workers for wages, even landowners themselves. For the first time, the peasant could imagine a future not bound by servitude. In England, entire villages were reborn, abandoned cottages were repaired, new wells dug, fields plowed anew. In France, peasants who had fled the 100 Years' War returned to sow their ruined lands. In Germany and the Low Countries, small communities gathered to rebuild mills and bridges. Across Europe, humanity was reclaiming its place. It was not easy. The scars of famine and death still haunted every family. Graves lined the edges of fields. Churches were half empty, but necessity gave birth to resilience. Peasants pooled their tools, shared animals, and worked communally to restore what they had lost. The church, too, began to soften. Monks and priests, many of whom had seen their flocks die, became more compassionate toward the poor. Sermons shifted from divine punishment to mercy and renewal. Hope, long buried under despair, began to grow again. The rise of new skills and markets. As towns recovered, trade flickered back to life. Peasants began selling surplus grain, wool, and cheese in weekly markets. Some became craftsmen, blacksmiths, millers, or carpenters, trading skills instead of labor. The rise of the market economy changed everything. No longer was a man's worth measured by his lord's favor, but by his own hands. With trade came travel. Young men left villages to work as seasonal laborers, sailors, or soldiers. Ideas spread along with goods. A farmer from Kent might now hear stories of Florence or Paris. A mason might learn new building methods from distant lands. Europe was awakening intellectually, too. The seeds of the Renaissance were sown not in palaces, but in these humble acts of recovery. For it was the peasants' endurance that made prosperity possible. Without their labor, there could be no art, no cathedral, no rebirth. The quiet power of the village. Village life remained simple but vibrant. Festivals returned, harvest feasts, midsummer dances, the blessing of the fields. Laughter once more filled the taverns where not long ago there had only been mourning. Families rebuilt not just homes but traditions. Songs about the plague turned into tales of survival. Prayers for mercy became hymns of gratitude. The rhythm of life, planting, growing, harvesting, beat on, stronger than ever. Peasants taught their children what they had learned the hard way, that the world could fall apart, but as long as they held the soil and one another, they would endure. That lesson became their inheritance. The slow death of feudalism. The lords who remained realized they could no longer command obedience by fear. They needed workers, and workers needed fair treatment. Many began leasing land for money rather than service. Others hired laborers year-round, giving rise to a new rural working class. In England and France, this shift marked the birth of a freer countryside. Peasants began to earn silver coins, to trade and save. Some bought their freedom outright. Others founded small farms of their own. Slowly, the idea of personal rights, once reserved for nobles, crept into the lives of common folk. Feudalism did not vanish overnight, but it began to wither like an old tree, its roots rotting beneath the soil. In its place, a new spirit grew: independence. The rebirth of faith and humanity. After so many years of loss, people rediscovered the divine in the ordinary. A sunrise over golden wheat, a newborn's cry, the laughter of neighbors, these became sacred once again. Artists and poets began to portray peasants not as faceless laborers, but as symbols of perseverance and grace. The peasant's toil was no longer invisible. It was celebrated as the heartbeat of creation. The very idea of common humanity, that all lives have worth, was born from these centuries of suffering and endurance. The long harvest. By the middle of the 1400s, Europe had entered a new age. The plagues still returned from time to time, but they no longer destroyed hope. Famine still came, but never broke the will to survive. The peasants had learned to bend but not break. They had survived nature, war, and tyranny, and in doing so, rebuilt the very foundation of the world. Their story was not of grand victory, but of quiet triumph. They did not conquer, they endured. They did not rule, they restored. And as the first rays of the Renaissance dawned across Europe, it was the peasants who had prepared the soil, both literally and spiritually, for that rebirth. The long harvest had finally come. They had lived through darkness, and now they walked toward the light.
In the forgotten corners of medieval Europe, long before the engines of empire roared, there lived a people without power, the peasants. They owned nothing but the soil beneath their fingernails, the faith in their hearts, and the will to survive. They tilled the earth that others ruled. They paid taxes to lords they rarely saw, prayed to a God they barely understood, and lived in a rhythm older than kingdoms. And yet, when Europe faced its darkest centuries, when plague, famine, and war swept the land, it was these nameless souls who held the world together. The first shadow, the plague, arrives. It began with a cough. No one knew where it came from. The sailors from the east, the rats in the grain, or the curse of a distant sin. But by the winter of 1347, the Black Death crept into every corner of Europe. Villages fell silent overnight. In France, whole families vanished. In England, parishes lost their priests faster than they could bury them. The air itself seemed poisoned. And yet the peasants endured. They buried their dead quietly, prayed in empty chapels, and returned to the fields. "If the Lord takes me," one English farmer wrote, "let him find me with a plow in hand." Their strength was not loud, it was steady, born from a lifetime of hardship. The second blow, famine and the sky's betrayal. When the plague loosened its grip, hunger took its place. From the years 1315 to 1322, Europe's skies turned cruel. Rains flooded the wheat fields, cold summers froze the grain, and livestock perished in mud. Bread became rarer than gold. In France, people ate dogs, cats, and sometimes worse. In England, markets collapsed. The poor boiled grass to survive. Mothers gave up their last loaf for their children. And yet, through the hunger, the peasants learned something powerful: collective survival. They shared seed grain,
rebuilt barns together, and divided what little they had. In a world ruled by the sword, they discovered a quieter weapon: solidarity. That shared endurance, historians now say, is what kept Europe alive. The Lord's grip, power, and defiance. Above them the Lord still ruled, armored men who believed the land was theirs by divine right. They demanded taxes, labor, and obedience. For centuries, this system of feudalism chained peasants to the soil like livestock. But the world was changing. The plague had killed so many that labor became precious. Suddenly, peasants realized their worth. When a lord demanded service, a farmer might simply walk away to another village, another master. A whisper grew across Europe: "If the land needs me, then I am free." From these whispers came revolts. In France, the Jacquerie. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and in the Low Countries. They were crushed, yes, but they left a scar, a message carved into history. The people who feed the world will not starve in silence. Faith, fear, and the fire within. Through it all, the church loomed above like the heavens, both a comfort and a chain. Monks preached repentance, bishops collected tithes, but even the church could not explain why God allowed such suffering. So the peasants turned inward. Faith became personal. The small wooden cross on a cottage wall meant more than the grandest cathedral. In those years, a quiet transformation took root, one that would later blossom into the Reformation. The belief that every soul could speak to God directly was born not in monasteries, but in muddy fields. The dawn after darkness. By the early 1400s, the world began to heal. Fields were sown again. Bells rang not for funerals, but for weddings. Villages rebuilt, markets reopened, and new trades emerged. Peasants began to sell their labor, to earn wages instead of giving service. With silver coins in hand, they could buy what they needed, a small miracle after centuries of bondage. And in this freedom, something even greater began: the slow rise of individual dignity. Pain had become progress. The seeds of a new age. Out of the plow and the prayer came ideas that would change the world. The peasants' quiet endurance inspired reformers, thinkers, and artists. The Renaissance, often remembered for its kings and painters, was watered by the sweat of these forgotten hands. Without them, there would have been no cities to flourish, no merchants to trade, no culture to rebirth. When the printing press spread across Europe, many of the first books were about faith, farming, and survival, the very essence of peasant life. The humble began to read, to think, to dream. 1,000 years of submission had forged a new kind of human, resilient, self-aware, unbroken. Legacy of the forgotten. Today, when we look back at medieval Europe, at its castles, cathedrals, and crowns, it's easy to forget the millions who lived and died unseen. But the truth is simple. It was not kings who rebuilt Europe after the plague, not nobles who tilled the fields after famine, not priests who fed the hungry. It was the peasants, barefoot, poor, nameless, who refused to give up. Their strength, invisible but eternal, shaped the world we inherited. The spirit that carried them through the Black Death is the same spirit that drives humanity to rise again after every disaster. And in that truth, beneath plague, famine, and Lord, the heartbeat of civilization never stopped.
How medieval peasants survived plagues, famines, and lords. In the heart of medieval Europe, peasants lived under the shadow of castles,
kings, and churches. Their world was made of mud, sweat, and prayer. They were born into fields, worked from sunrise to sunset, and often died before their time. Yet somehow they survived centuries of plagues, famine, and the crushing rule of lords. This is their story, told not through kings and knights, but through the hands that fed the world. The life of a medieval peasant was simple, but never easy. Every morning began with the ringing of the church bell. Men and women left their small wooden huts to work on the Lord's land. They plowed the fields, sowed seeds, and harvested crops that were not entirely theirs. Most of what they grew was taken as tax or rent, leaving only a little to feed their families. Still they worked, because survival meant obedience. The first great disaster came with the plague. In the middle of the 14th century, a deadly sickness swept through Europe. It was called the Black Death. Within a few short years, nearly half the population was gone. Villages turned silent, churches were full of graves, families vanished overnight. The peasants who lived through it saw death in every corner, yet they kept going. They buried their loved ones and returned to their fields. The fear was deep, but their courage was deeper. The plague did something unexpected. It changed society. With so many people gone, there were not enough workers to farm the land. Lords needed peasants more than peasants needed lords. For the first time, the poor began to demand fair wages. Some even left their villages to find better work in towns. The old system of control started to break. The world was changing, slowly but surely. But after the plague came hunger. Crops failed again and again. Long winters and endless rain destroyed harvests. The Great Famine of the early 1300s was one of the darkest times in Europe. People ate bark, grass, and even the remains of animals long dead. Many starved. Yet the peasants learned the power of sharing. They cooked together, helped one another, and survived together. Their strength was in unity, not wealth. The lords still demanded taxes and labor, but peasants began to resist. They realized their work kept kingdoms alive. Without them, no lord could feast, no church could stand, no army could march. Slowly, whispers of freedom began to spread. In England, a priest named John Ball preached equality. He asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" It was a dangerous question, but it opened hearts and minds. Soon those whispers turned into rebellion. In 1381, the peasants' revolt shook England. Thousands marched toward London, led by a man named Wat Tyler. They wanted justice, fair taxes, and freedom from servitude. Though the revolt was crushed, its message lived on. Across Europe, from France to Germany, peasants began to rise. They fought not for power, but for dignity. Even as revolts failed, change continued. Feudalism, the system that tied peasants to the land, began to crumble. Lords needed to pay for labor now. Peasants started earning money. With coins in hand, they could rent land or buy small plots. They were no longer just servants, they were workers with value. Markets grew. Villages turned into towns. Freedom was slowly taking root. By the 1400s, Europe looked different. The plague had returned in waves, but each time people recovered faster. Farming improved with new tools. Trade routes expanded. The children of peasants became blacksmiths, merchants, and craftsmen. Their simple lives built the foundation for a new age, the Renaissance. The art, architecture, and science that would soon flourish were all fed by the labor of these forgotten farmers. What made peasants survive was not luck, it was resilience. They endured every storm that history threw at them. They faced war, hunger, and disease, yet they kept their faith. They believed that life must go on. Their churches were small, their clothes were rough, but their hearts were stronger than iron. While nobles fought for glory and land, peasants fought for survival. But through that struggle, they built the Europe we know today. The roads they paved, the crops they grew, the towns they built, all became the bones of a new civilization. Every grain of wheat, every loaf of bread, every marketplace was proof of their endurance. By the end of the Middle Ages, the world had changed forever. The great castles of the lords were fading in power. The voice of the common man was rising. The seed of equality had been planted, watered by centuries of sweat and sorrow. When historians speak of progress, they often speak of kings, scientists, and explorers. But the real story began in the dirt. It began with peasants who refused to give up. They taught humanity the meaning of survival. Their story is not one of triumph through war, but through endurance. In every modern city, in every harvest, and in every worker's hand, there lives a trace of them, the medieval peasants who faced the plagues, the famine, and the cruelty of their lords, and still found a way to live, love, and hope. They did not conquer the world, but they built the one we inherited.
The seeds of freedom, how peasants paved the road to modern Europe. When the dust of the Middle Ages began to settle, Europe stood on the edge of transformation. The old world of castles, lords, and feudal chains was starting to fade. The people who had been trapped at the bottom of society, the peasants, had endured plagues, famine, and endless wars. Now their endurance was shaping something new. Out of the fields and villages that had once known only toil and fear, the first seeds of freedom began to grow. For hundreds of years, peasants had lived under rules written by others. They could not travel without permission. They could not own the land they farmed. Their lives were measured by seasons and taxes. But as time passed, the cracks in the feudal system widened. Lords lost power. Kings grew desperate for money, and towns began to rise like islands of opportunity. In these growing towns, everything was different. A man could work, earn coins, and build a new life. A woman could trade goods in the marketplace. Craftsmen, blacksmiths, and farmers turned into merchants. The more they traded, the more they realized that wealth did not come only from noble birth. It came from work. It came from skill. It came from human effort. Across Europe, small revolutions were taking place quietly. Peasants were learning to read. Churches began keeping records in local languages instead of Latin. Children grew up hearing stories not only of saints and kings, but of brave villagers who stood up to unfair taxes or cruel masters. These small changes slowly reshaped how people saw themselves. The Great Plague had taken millions of lives, but it had also changed the balance of power. Fewer workers meant higher wages. Landlords had to compete for labor. Many peasants used this chance to move to better lands or towns where freedom was offered. In England, serfdom began to disappear. In parts of France and Germany, peasants were able to buy their freedom. The idea that a man's worth could not be measured by birth was taking root. Still, it was not an easy road. Lords and kings did not give up control willingly. They imposed new taxes and laws to keep peasants tied to the land. But now, the people were no longer silent. When injustice returned, rebellion followed. The memory of past uprisings lived on. The spirit of Wat Tyler, John Ball, and countless unknown rebels whispered through the villages. The poor had learned one thing: when they stood together, they could not be ignored. The church, too, began to change. Once it had preached obedience and silence, but as centuries passed, new voices rose within it. Reformers spoke against corruption. They said that faith belonged to every person, not just the priests. The printing press helped spread these new ideas quickly. For the first time, peasants could read the Bible for themselves. Knowledge became power, and power began to spread. Markets grew into towns, and towns became cities. Trade connected distant regions.
Ships crossed oceans, bringing new goods and new possibilities. The children of peasants became part of this expanding world. Some became sailors, explorers, or craftsmen in faraway lands. Others stayed home, but lived freer lives than their parents could ever imagine. By the 1500s, Europe was entering a new age, the dawn of the modern world. And behind this new dawn were centuries of struggle by ordinary people who refused to break. The peasants of medieval Europe had not only survived history, they had written it in their own quiet way. The new freedom was not just about land or money, it was about thought. People began to question old hierarchies. They asked why kings ruled by divine right. They wondered why the poor should suffer while the rich lived in comfort. Philosophers began to write about justice and equality. Artists painted the faces of common people, not just nobles. For the first time, the story of humanity included everyone. This slow awakening was built upon the endurance of generations. Every field plowed, every rebellion fought, every prayer whispered in a cold church, it all led here. The peasants who had once bent their backs under the weight of the world had lifted it instead. They had given birth to a new idea, that every person has worth. As the centuries turned, these ideas traveled across borders. They inspired revolutions in France and America. They gave rise to new laws, new governments, and new rights. The dream that had once been only a whisper in the fields became the foundation of democracy itself. Still, freedom came at a price. The world grew richer, but also more complex. The old inequalities did not vanish, they changed shape. Yet the memory of those medieval farmers who faced death and still chose life remained like a seed buried deep in the soil of history. It would bloom again whenever people stood up against injustice. The modern Europe that emerged from the Middle Ages was not just built by kings or scientists. It was built by hands that had known hunger and pain. The cathedrals that touch the sky, the bridges that cross rivers, the roads that link cities, all were built by the descendants of peasants. Their courage became the invisible foundation of progress. Looking back, it is easy to forget their names. History often remembers the powerful, not the patient. But if you listen closely, you can still hear their echo in every freedom we enjoy today. They taught the world that endurance is the first step toward liberty, that strength can come from unity, and that even the smallest seed, when nurtured by hope, can grow into a forest of change. The peasants of medieval Europe did not dream of empires or glory. They dreamed of bread, peace, and fairness. Yet from those humble dreams, a new civilization was born. Their story reminds us that every great age begins not with kings, but with the people who refuse to give up. The road to modern Europe was paved with their footsteps, their struggles, and their hope. They were the first builders of freedom, the quiet heroes of history, proof that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can rise like the dawn.
The hidden lives of medieval women. Power, survival, and secrets behind the castle walls. In the heart of medieval Europe, behind the stone walls of castles and the mud floors of cottages, lived women whose names history often forgot. They were queens, healers, peasants, and mothers. Their world was one of silence and strength, hardship and hidden power. Though men ruled with swords and crowns, women shaped the world with endurance, courage, and quiet wisdom. Most people imagine medieval women as weak or voiceless, but the truth was far more complex. From the grand halls of royal courts to the smoky kitchens of tiny villages, women held families, farms, and even kingdoms together. They wove the fabric of society while surviving plagues, famine, and wars. For noble women, life behind castle walls was not as glamorous as legends suggest. A noble lady was born to duty, not freedom. She was expected to marry for politics, not love. Her wedding was often arranged before she was even a teenager. But once married, she became the manager of estates, servants, and armies when her husband went to war. Some of these women were brilliant administrators, strong leaders, and even warriors. One of them was Eleanor of Aquitaine. She defied every expectation. In a world ruled by men, she ruled two kingdoms, France and England, and shaped the politics of Europe for nearly 50 years. She sponsored poets, led armies, and raised kings. Her story was proof that intelligence could be more powerful than a sword. But not every woman wore silk and gold. Most lived in small villages, far from the noise of courts and battles. Peasant women rose before sunrise, cooked, milked animals, planted crops, and cared for children, all while working alongside their husbands in the fields. Their lives were endless cycles of labor, prayer, and survival. Yet even in hardship, they found moments of beauty. They sang while weaving cloth, told stories by the fire, and passed down herbal knowledge that kept their families alive when doctors could not. In times of plague and famine, women became the heart of resilience. When sickness swept through villages, it was the mothers, wives, and midwives who stayed to nurse the dying. They mixed herbs, whispered prayers, and faced death without armor. Their courage was quiet, but unmatched. Many women in medieval Europe were also keepers of knowledge. Long before modern medicine, women healers and midwives used herbs, roots, and natural remedies to treat illness. They learned by observation, by tradition, and by faith. Some were respected, but others were feared. In later centuries, many of these women were accused of witchcraft, not because of evil, but because of wisdom that men did not understand. In convents, another kind of woman's world existed. Behind the stone walls of monasteries, nuns lived lives of study and devotion. They copied books by hand, preserved classical knowledge, and educated girls who would otherwise never learn to read. For some, the convent was a prison. For others, it was a refuge, a place where they could think, write, and find purpose beyond marriage. One remarkable woman was Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess who became a composer, philosopher, and scientist in the 12th century. She wrote music, letters to kings, and books on nature and medicine. At a time when women were expected to be silent, her voice echoed across Europe. Even in the shadows of history, women found ways to create light. They shaped art, religion, and even law. Queens acted as diplomats, mothers passed on traditions, and widows managed lands when men were gone to war. Every act of survival was a quiet revolution. Marriage and motherhood defined most women's lives, but within those boundaries, they built entire worlds. A mother's role was sacred and vital. She not only raised children, but taught them values, skills, and faith. In a sense, she built the future of Europe one generation at a time. Still, life could be cruel. Many women died young, from childbirth, disease, or poverty. The church often told them that obedience was their greatest virtue, yet the same church depended on their service, their care, and their work. Even saints like Joan of Arc, who rose to lead armies, faced betrayal and death because the world could not yet accept a woman's strength. But change was coming. As towns grew and education spread, women began to carve new roles for themselves. Some became writers, artists, or business owners. Others joined movements for reform and charity. Slowly, the image of the medieval woman began to evolve, from silent servant to active shaper of history. Their legacy still lives today. When modern women vote, teach, or lead, they walk on paths first carved by those who came before.
Every act of courage, every quiet defiance, every whisper of resistance in the Middle Ages planted a seed that would grow into the idea of equality centuries later. Behind every knight's glory was a woman's endurance. Behind every kingdom's success was a mother's teaching. And behind every church bell that rang across the countryside, there were women whose voices were rarely heard, but whose work built the world we now live in. The story of medieval women is not one of silence. It is one of survival. They endured chains and expectations, yet found ways to rise within them. They shaped faith, family, and freedom in ways history is only beginning to understand. Their courage reminds us that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through generations. Sometimes it hides behind castle walls, waiting for the world to finally listen.
The rise of the forgotten inventors, medieval minds that changed the world. In the shadow of castles and cathedrals, far from the glory of kings and knights, another kind of hero lived in medieval Europe. These heroes did not wield swords or crowns. They worked in silence with wood, metal, and fire. They were the forgotten inventors, the thinkers, builders, and dreamers who changed the world long before the age of science began. When people think of the Middle Ages, they often imagine darkness and ignorance. But that image is only half true. Beneath the surface of war and religion, Europe was alive with invention. From small villages to grand monasteries, human curiosity never slept. Every blacksmith, mason, and scholar carried a spark that would light the path to the modern world. The medieval mind was practical, creative, and brave. Life was hard, and survival demanded innovation. Farmers experimented with new tools to make work faster. Builders learned to raise cathedrals that touched the sky. Sailors studied stars to navigate endless seas. Every discovery, big or small, became a stepping stone toward progress. One of the most important inventions of the era was the mechanical clock. Before it appeared, people measured time by the sun, by candles, or by the ringing of church bells. But in the 13th century, European monks began building machines that ticked, turned, and chimed with precision. These clocks changed how humans understood time itself. Hours became measurable, and work became structured. From monasteries to marketplaces, life began to move in rhythm. Another quiet revolution came from the fields, the heavy plow. This simple but powerful tool transformed agriculture. With its iron blade and deep-cutting design, it allowed farmers to cultivate Europe's tough northern soils. Villages grew, food increased, and hunger slowly retreated. The heavy plow helped feed the Renaissance before anyone even knew the word existed. Then came the windmill. It turned the invisible power of the wind into energy. From grinding grain to pumping water, windmills changed the rural landscape of Europe. They symbolized the human desire to tame nature with knowledge rather than fear. In workshops and forges, other minds were at work. The art of metalworking led to stronger armor, sharper tools, and eventually early machines. The blacksmith was not only a craftsman, he was a scientist of fire and iron. Every strike of the hammer carried centuries of trial, error, and improvement. Meanwhile, in monasteries, another revolution was happening quietly, the revolution of knowledge. Monks copied ancient texts by hand, preserving Greek, Roman, and Arabic wisdom. Without them, the foundations of modern science, medicine, and philosophy would have been lost forever. It was through these efforts that Europe met one of its greatest inventions, paper and the printing press. For centuries, books were rare and handwritten, seen only by the wealthy or the clergy. But when Johannes Gutenberg built his printing press in the 14th century, knowledge broke free from the walls of power. For the first time, Anyone who could read could learn. Books became weapons of thought, and ideas began to move faster than armies. But not all inventors were scholars or nobles. Many were ordinary artisans. In Italy, glassmakers in Venice perfected the art of clear glass, leading to the first optical lenses. These lenses helped people see the stars more clearly, and eventually helped Galileo look to the heavens. In France, craftsmen built watermills that powered entire industries. In England, tanners and weavers developed methods that fueled trade for centuries. Each small improvement built on another. Together, they created the foundation for what historians would later call the scientific revolution. The medieval inventors were also dreamers. Some sketched flying machines, others designed weapons of impossible power. The most famous of these dreamers was Leonardo da Vinci, who lived at the edge of the medieval and modern worlds. His notebooks were filled with drawings of gears, bridges, and helicopters. But Leonardo was not the first. He was the heir to hundreds of nameless inventors who paved the way before him. While Europe advanced, the world beyond its borders was also alive with innovation. From the Islamic world came algebra, astronomy, and surgical tools. From China came gunpowder, paper, and the compass. Medieval Europe learned, borrowed, and built upon these discoveries. The world was connected by ideas long before it was connected by ships. By the late Middle Ages, invention had become part of life itself. Builders raised cathedrals so tall they defied belief. Engineers built bridges that carried armies and dreams. And across the seas, shipbuilders created vessels strong enough to explore the unknown. It is easy to forget how fragile progress once was. Each discovery could have been lost to war, plague, or ignorance. Yet time and again, people rebuilt, relearned, and reimagined. That resilience, the belief that the world could be improved, became Europe's greatest invention of all. Today, when we look at skyscrapers, airplanes, and satellites, we see the descendants of those medieval ideas. Every gear, every screw, every clock that ticks owes something to the nameless builders of the Middle Ages. They may not have had electricity, but they had imagination. And imagination is the root of every modern miracle. The story of the forgotten inventors is not just a story of machines. It is a story of human spirit, of minds that refused to stop asking, what if, even when the world around them was dark and uncertain. They taught us that genius does not need comfort, it needs curiosity. That progress does not begin in laboratories, it begins in the human will to make life better. And that even in the quietest villages, surrounded by hunger and fear, there were always people dreaming of light. The medieval inventors may be forgotten by name, but their ideas still move the hands of every clock, the sails of every ship, and the heart of every dreamer who believes that knowledge can change the world. The lost knowledge of the ancient builders, secrets that shaped the medieval world. Long before machines, computers, or even maps, the ancient world built wonders that still defy logic. The Great Pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals all whisper the same question: how did they do it? And perhaps more importantly, what knowledge did humanity lose along the way? By the time the medieval age arrived, much of the wisdom of the ancient builders had vanished into dust and legend. But their echoes remained in stones, ruins, and stories. Medieval Europe inherited those whispers, and from them, a new generation of builders emerged, determined to rediscover the forgotten secrets of the past. The Middle Ages were not as dark as many believe. In fact, they were a bridge, a link between the lost brilliance of antiquity and the rising light of modern science. The builders of cathedrals, castles, and fortresses carried fragments of knowledge passed down through centuries. But they didn't just copy, They experimented, improved, and in doing so, they reshaped the world. Take the cathedrals of France, for example. Notre Dame, Chartres, Reims, these were not just places of worship. They were masterpieces of geometry, light, and sound. The architects behind them understood balance and pressure in ways that modern engineers still study. They used mathematical ratios so precise that sunlight poured through stained glass like a divine code. And yet many of these architects left no records, no blueprints, no written proof. It was as if they built through memory, guided by something older than books. Some historians believe these designs carried influences from Roman engineering, Islamic geometry, and even ancient Egyptian symbolism. Trade routes and crusades brought Europe into contact with the East, where advanced mathematics, astronomy, and architecture still thrived. The medieval builders learned by watching, adapting, and merging these global traditions. In England, the masons who raised massive stone castles used ancient techniques of interlocking stones, the same methods seen in Incan and Greek ruins. Their walls could withstand centuries of weather, fire, and war. How did they achieve such precision without modern tools? Perhaps they rediscovered something humanity once knew, or perhaps they simply trusted experience more than measurement. Then there were the mystical builders, the alchemists, monks, and scholars who saw architecture as sacred art. They believed every arch, every pillar, and every pattern carried spiritual meaning. Geometry was not just math, it was a language between man and God. The circle symbolized heaven, the square the earth, and the triangle the divine connection between the two. To build was to pray, to shape stone into faith. Hidden within cathedrals were codes, secret carvings, strange symbols, and mysterious faces that watched from the walls. Some think these were messages left by the masons themselves. Others say they preserved ancient wisdom for future generations. Whatever the truth, their legacy endures in silence and stone. Medieval builders also inherited ancient engineering from the Romans. The art of aqueducts, arches, and concrete slowly returned. The forgotten science of cement, lost for centuries, was rediscovered in pieces. Water mills, bridges, and even early heating systems appeared again, inspired by ruins that dotted the European landscape. But perhaps the most mysterious knowledge of all was that of sacred proportions. Builders of the Middle Ages seemed to understand how numbers could create harmony. The golden ratio, a mathematical pattern found in nature, music, and art, appeared again in cathedrals, paintings, and even music. Some scholars believe this was no coincidence. It was the rediscovery of a universal code that ancient civilizations had once mastered. The Renaissance, often celebrated as the rebirth of knowledge, was really the moment when medieval minds finally unlocked these ancient secrets completely. Figures like Brunelleschi studied Roman ruins to build Florence's Great Dome. Leonardo da Vinci examined the proportions of the human body as if it were a living cathedral. The flame that ancient builders lit thousands of years earlier burned again, brighter than ever. Yet even today, modern science cannot explain everything about ancient or medieval construction. The precision of the Great Pyramid, the acoustics of Hagia Sophia, or the endurance of Gothic cathedrals still inspire awe. Engineers use lasers and 3D models to study them, but the full mystery remains unsolved. What we do know is this: progress was never a straight line. Knowledge was lost, found, and transformed countless times. Humanity built, forgot, and rebuilt again. Every generation stood on the shoulders of those who came before, even if their names were long forgotten. In a way, the lost knowledge of the ancient builders never truly vanished. It lives on in our cities, our bridges, our skyscrapers. The same principles of balance, weight, and light guide the architecture of the modern world. Every time we raise a building to the sky, we echo those who did it first, with bare hands and boundless imagination. The story of the ancient builders is a reminder of something timeless, that human curiosity is stronger than destruction, that even when knowledge is buried, the desire to create never dies. In every stone laid, in every dome raised, and every question asked about the past, we continue their work. Because the builders of history were never just workers, they were dreamers who believed that what they built could touch eternity. And maybe, just maybe, that's the greatest secret they left behind.